So, Leanne, what are you hearing, and what's your sense of where things are headed in tomorrow's ethics meeting?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of pressure on these Republican members in the Ethics Committee to not release this report. The fact that Speaker Johnson came out and said after he was at Mar-a-Lago that the ethics report should not come out, which is a reversal of what he had said a couple days prior. So there does seem to be the heavy hand from Trump world is weighing heavily on these Republican House members. Meanwhile, in the Senate, we're also seeing a subtle shift. When Gates's nomination was announced last week, at first there was shock, and then there was hesitance that he would be able to get confirmed. And then now we're seeing senators start to slide back a little bit, where a couple senators last night, including Senator John Cornyn, Senator Thom Tillis, who is up for re-election in 2026, say, well, maybe this ethics report isn't necessary for this confirmation process. We do know, as Ali said, that President-elect Trump is calling senators himself. I'm also told that people close to Trump are also gauging where senators stand to see if these nominees can pass through the Senate. But this is just the beginning of, if Donald Trump continues to stand by his man, the pressure campaign is going to get only more and more intense as they get closer. It's also important to note that Matt Gaetz is making calls himself. He has called members, Republican members of the Judiciary Committee, and asking them to ensure that he gets what he is asking for, a fair hearing.
So, Jennifer, Vance is on the Hill tomorrow. Trump's calling senators to get them to back Gaetz. Gaetz is calling people. We just heard, in fact, there on Capitol Hill from Lindsey Graham, the top Republican on the Judiciary Committee, saying that nobody should be disqualified because of a report in the media. How do you see it? Is this a test to see how far Trump can get Republicans to go?
Well, it's certainly going to end up being one regardless. But, Graham's kind of ridiculous comment about nobody should be denied, because of a report in the media. He's right. He should be denied because of a report that is, on the desks of the Ethics Committee. And there is precedent to release this information. And this is a case where it's absolutely imperative that this be released. We're talking about a guy who's going to be appointed to be the Attorney General of the United States of America, who has had very credible accusations, according to reports, made against him. And I know people are going to push back on that word credible. These are women who have not sought fame or notoriety or money or anything else. We're told that there are Venmo receipts and text messages back and forth that, that Gaetz was engaged in this behavior. That alone disqualifies him to be the Attorney General. And when it comes to the pushback that some of these folks in the Senate are getting right now, from whether it's from Vance or Trump or anybody else, Matt Gaetz is in a tough situation. He is not a good guy. He doesn't have a lot of friends in the party. He has not set himself up to be very well supported in this kind of a situation. So, if the Ethics Committee or others end up really standing firm and releasing this information about him, I believe it's the right thing to do. It's how you protect constitutional leadership, but it's also going to be in large part his own fault.
Yeah, John Cornyn, a Republican in the Senate, said that we need to have complete vetting of the nominees, not only so we know that the nominee is qualified, but also to protect the president. So you are hearing that from at least some Republicans who will have to vote to confirm. Leanne, we also heard the House Ethics Chair say Speaker Johnson's opposition to releasing this report won't influence Republicans on the committee. Do you buy that?
I mean, no one knows what's happening inside people's heads, but that's not how this place works around here. When you have a message, a very public message from the Speaker of the House, usually members, and for most cases, fall in line, especially when it's not necessarily about Matt Gaetz. It's about Donald Trump and Donald Trump being successful in his presidency. There's a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill. I would say most Republicans on Capitol Hill do not not like Matt Gaetz. In fact, they severely dislike Matt Gaetz for a whole host of reasons, personal, professional. They think he's a chaos agent. But what matters now is that Donald Trump is president, and most of these Republicans have been unwilling to buck the president, especially a new president-elect, I should say, especially as he's coming in, starting to form his cabinet. Usually members of Congress, the Senate, give deference to a president on their cabinet choices for the most part. And when it comes to Matt Gaetz, they're going to have to choose between potentially, someone they dislike, someone who they think is not qualified for the job, or going against the leader of their party.
And it's not just Matt Gaetz. There's the, controversies surrounding multiple cabinet picks, from Gaetz to RFK Jr. to Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense to Tulsi Gabbard at DNI. By the way, this is a live picture as Speaker Johnson's right now addressing reporters on Capitol Hill. We're monitoring this. If he says anything about this confirmation process about Matt Gaetz specifically, we'll of course bring that to you. Meantime, Jennifer, here's what Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal said about the prospect of calling these two witnesses, these accusers of Gaetz, to testify in any confirmation hearings.
They've been victimized once. I am loath to victimize them again if they are resistant to relive the pain and grief of that time in their lives. If there are alternatives, I would vastly prefer to use them, and even talking about the subpoena or having them come forward, I think puts pressure on them.
So that's another argument for turning over that report from the House Ethics Committee to the senators. And I just think back to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and confirmation process, after his accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, came forward and had to testify. Why would someone want to put themselves through this type of high-profile congressional testimony, especially now you have someone like, Elon Musk, with one of the world's biggest bullhorns already downplaying these allegations?
Right. And the danger and destruction of Elon Musk and this team is a conversation for another day we could really get into. But, anytime somebody comes forward with these kinds of accusations, especially under these circumstances, we have to be very cognizant of whether the necessity of knowing the truth about people who are going to be put in very powerful positions. I think their attorneys have been very clear. Their attorney has been very clear. They don't want to. They aren't particularly seeking it. None of us know who they are. They've been very conscientious about protecting their own identities in all of this. But we have to remember, those of us who spend all this time talking about reprehensible politicians like Matt Gaetz, is that there are good people in the world, that most people in this world want what is right and good for our country. And I think that many people in this position are led by character and honor and wanting to make sure that the people know what the truth is. And when it comes to Matt Gaetz, I'm going to use the word again. He is reprehensible. He is a reprehensible nominee. And I think that it will not surprise me if they decide to come forward and share that. I think they have an obligation to share as much information as possible.